This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host Gilad Halpern. My co-host Dalia Shandin is away this week, sadly, but she'll be back shortly. Every week, she and I bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we like, and hopefully you do too. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us because we're counting on you and every little helps. My guest today is Itai Lotem, a senior lecturer in French studies at the University of Westminster in London. His book, The Memory of Colonialism in Britain and France, The Sins of Silence, has just been published by Palgrave Macmillan as part of the Cambridge Imperial and Post-Colonial Studies series. His very Israeli name might be misleading, but his very distinctive Birmingham accent will immediately clear away all confusion. That is the fact that he's as British as they come, and he's now joining us on the line from the UK. Dr. Itai Lotem, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you for having me here. I mean, I'm sure my Birmingham accent has been kind of tampered with quite a few years down south, but we'll do our best.
Okay. Well, we'll let our listeners judge that and, of course, focus more on what you have to say rather than how you say it. Okay, so let's start. What is memory as an object of investigation for you? Because you write that your study, and I quote, is not an inspection of colonial legacies, undercurrent residues still left from colonial hangovers, or racist modes of thinking that still haunt the post-colonial world, end quote. If it's not that, what is it?
I think one of the important things of looking at memory is looking at it as a political process, as a way of talking about the past, not necessarily in terms of legacies of things that just kind of undercurrent, invisible, but as a process of reinterpreting moments, of actually telling ourselves who we are and telling ourselves what kind of past we want to remember. One probably silly example, but a good example of talking about even how colonial history is talked about or remembered is probably, and that is definitely not something that I wrote about in my book, but I'm not sure you would remember this kind of small scandal that erupted around Ken Livingstone in London in 2000. I don't think many people do remember because it was kind of a non-scandal.
Then Mayor of London, right?
It was at the time the Mayor of London, so it was the first kind of Mayor of London. And at the time, I mean, now he's of course more remembered, more talked about as a part of Labour's ongoing anti-Semitism saga. But at the time, let's think about him as the Mayor of London. Also, let's think about him as someone who had come from the very kind of hard left of the party, usually referred to as Red Ken. And he starts this scandal by suggesting that two of the plinths in Trafalgar Square that hold the statues of two generals, Napier and Havelock, should be replaced with something else. So these statues of generals should be removed, and instead something else should actually be there. Now, the reasoning for that is not the reasoning that we would think of today when talking about statues, that these generals represent any kind of memory of something we would like to change, that these generals who actually had taken part in colonial wars represent something that we would like to kind of change about our society, something racist, something that is painful. The actual rationale he had was that nobody knew who they were. And it was entirely untrue. I mean, I've been using this anecdote with students for years and years and years, and every time I'd ask them, do you know who's in Trafalgar Square? This kind of square which you cross relatively often. I mean, Westminster isn't far away from there. And the answer is, of course, no. Do you know who Napier and Havelock are? No. And that kind of shows something about the transmission of memory. The idea that if something isn't talked about, something isn't a part of our political mechanism, it kind of loses its power to become memory. That history around it is still legacy. It is still it still affects who we are today. But the actual question of remembrance as a political process, as something that actually inspires debate, is not necessarily there. And one of the reasons I kind of started thinking about it this way is, again, through much of the literature today in memory studies about many sort of different sort of modes of memory or transmissions or any of these things, in which memory could now be anything. There are many kind of works that kind of struggle to place memory as kind of something that really incites debate, but is something that could be anything, this kind of, how can you say it? Something that is even subconscious, something that could always be woken up into life. And at some point, I guess that it just kind of loses its analytical force.
So in a way, the memory is more about the present than about the past, and the merit of studying post-colonial memory is that as you show, the imperial past, the colonial past, is very much talked about in both countries.
So I think that question has two elements to it. Like, the first part of it is that memory is about the present. Memory is how societies relate to their past, but people do it through their understanding of themselves in the present, through their priorities of the present. So memory is always more actually about the present. The second thing, and this is where colonial history matters, and how we get to talking about colonial history and who talks about colonial history. And in both countries, in France and Britain, talking about colonial history has a very different, how can you say, just kind of a very different political meaning. And I think that saying that right now both things are talked about is very true. However, when I started working on this project, it was at the time as a PhD student about nearly 10 years ago, I came at it through a very different, through a very different idea. And at the time, what I realized was that there was a very loud debate in France about the memory of colonialism, about colonial history. It wasn't a nice debate. It was probably as toxic as it gets. And at the same time, working on this comparative project, I also realized that there was no debate in Britain. There was very little talk about colonialism. There was very little talk about this kind of history that has actually shaped this island entirely. This has changed since. So if you can look at the big sort of explosions of debate since 2016, especially since 2016, that it has changed entirely. But the very sort of beginning of how it happened, how it erupted, who decides to speak about, who incites this debate, is very different in both countries.
Can you tell us in what ways they're different?
Oh, so that I guess that here you really have to start looking at very different sort of elements of what memory is and how the memory of colonialism has developed into a political debate about the kind of about very sort of specific questions of identity and where we are as a society really today. And one of the things that you see also in both countries is that this inciting of debate happens through people trying to break some kind of a silence. In France, already in the 1990s, you see people like, let's say, the historian Benjamin Stora, now extremely well known. He is the director of the Immigration Museum in Paris. He also just kind of wrote a report about moving forward in relations between France and Algeria. And in the 1990s, he makes a name for himself as a historian activist who tries to break the silence on Algeria. So there is a silence to break, and he is going to be the one who breaks it. Now, this in itself is a part of a blueprint, you can say, of memorial activism, of, first of all, identifying silence. Secondly, say that breaking this silence will create some kind of a more progressive society, will heal the wounds of society. It is something that I think we all recognize from from a different type of memory debate. I mean, something that kind of starts in West Germany in the late 1960s, and kind of establishes itself as a blueprint of how to deal with difficult memories. I mean, I don't think there is a real word for it. As far as I got, is introspective memory. How do we, as a society, deal with the dark stains of our past? How do we, as a society, deal with having been the baddies in a way?
But how could it have been silenced, especially in France, that the colonial experience goes well into the post-war period, and does it with quite a lot of pomp and circumstance? And I'm talking about the Algerian War. I mean, it's not something that could be ignored in any shape or form.
Now, that is where the concept of silence becomes problematic or interesting to look at. I mean, especially in France. Now, if we talk about silence, then we are talking about this idea that after decolonization, so definitely after the Algerian War of Independence, but also the Algerian War of Independence is not the only moment of independence of French colonies. So it's not the only colony that gets its independence, but definitely the bloodiest war of decolonization in the French context. Then the idea of silence is based on the fact that after decolonization, after official decolonization, there is let's say, an inability or a lack of desire to talk about this history publicly. That means to commemorate it. That means to learn about it, to talk about it, to turn it into a political element of everyday life. Whether this is the case is, of course, a whole different question. And you can see that in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, there are elements of state silence, of course, about colonialism, and especially about Algeria. The Algerian War of Independence is for quite a few years not considered officially a war. By the state, it is considered a peacekeeping operation to avoid calling it a war. That has, of course, very clear ramifications on people who had fought there, but also people who moved from there, not always very willingly. That is one way of talking about silence as an official thing, not being allowed to actually call it a war. The second thing is, of course, whether there is much interest in society in talking about it, whether society actually, whether it's a priority in terms of, let's say, school programs, in terms of the state acknowledging crimes of this war, etc., etc., etc. When it comes to the Algerian War actually itself, it's very hard to speak of silence in the late 60s, early 70s, especially sort of different sort of leftist student groups adopt the Algerian War of Independence as definitely something that is a part of their identity. You see lots of films, lots of books. It's very hard to say that it is absent from public debate. In the early 70s, as also in the early 80s, you still have these debates about torture in Algeria that return to basically haunt the public conversation in France. But it's only in 1999 that the state acknowledges that Algerian War had actually been a war. So what you have here when it comes to the Algerian War is this kind of discrepancy between public attention, public understanding of the war, but then, of course, the state. So the state in France, first of all, means a lot, but secondly, when it comes to Algeria, it tries to implement different mechanisms of silence, whether official amnesties after the war that are implemented to avoid any sort of ramifications for people who fought in Algeria on both sides, but then also the inability to actually acknowledge the war was the war. So that only, of course, changes in 1999. But in the meantime, you can say that because the state has not acknowledged it, there is a silence. But then again, silence also doesn't necessarily mean that nobody knows it existed. But also, and this is a very big part of the first sort of movement in the 1990s, especially by people like Stoa, but not only, to talk about the Algerian War of Independence, is to talk about it as an important thing in French history. So if in the 70s and 80s, there is a whole movement to acknowledge the importance of Vichy, of the Second World War, in French history, in French identity, then in the 1990s, you have a new generation of people who are also influenced very often by the whole movement in the 70s and 80s to talk about the Second World War, who demand to start dealing with the role of the Algerian War of Independence, but also the Algerian colonialism.
Yes, you show in the book how it really evolves. I mean, the activism to talk about the memory of the empire is using the same vocabulary as those who a few decades before were fighting to talk about the memory of the French collaboration with the Nazis. Can you tell us how one evolved into the other, how that vocabulary was transmitted to this new topic?
So I think that what my book also tries to show is that one of the important things about the development of vocabulary in France, and then, of course, one of the questions of why this vocabulary doesn't exist in Britain, comes from the establishment of memory, and especially the concept of devoir de mémoire in France, of the state's duty to commemorate the fate of its own victims, as a political priority. And this is something that gets established through, first of all, actual fights and battles by Jewish activists in the 70s and 80s, and then afterwards in the early 90s, it also kind of gets consolidated as kind of a blueprint. You now know what memory politics means, and also what is, you can say, the purpose of wanting to get state acknowledgement for the state's crimes. You can say that this is partly a matter of redress, but this also establishes a whole sort of, we can say, a whole sort of set of possible outcomes of memory politics. This means, this means recognition of the state for its own crimes. So, for example, the Chirac speech of Veldiv in 1995. It means also the persecution of criminals, despite amnesties. So here the use of the category of crimes against humanity. It also means the creation of memorial days, of memorials. So it actually gives you a very sort of clear idea of how to commemorate any kind of a crime. Now, this is, of course, it's very specific to the French responsibility to the fate of its Jewish citizens. But as, of course, France, kind of debate in France actually becomes a bit more concerned with France as a multiracial, multicultural society, you start seeing representatives of other groups also trying to realize that if they want to get a voice in France, if they want to get to also explain their own belonging in this kind of post-colonial France, they need to kind of find a way to talk about this, you can say, trauma that led them there. One of the first sort of, you can say, modes of continuities is with Antillean, so Caribbean activists living in Paris. So these are people who, up until the early 1990s, used to be nationalists, so people who thought of the Caribbean territories as something that needed to be independent from France. And in the 1990s, actually become a bit more a bit more concerned with community activism. They realize that kind of nationalism or independentism is a failed project, and they want to establish a more sort of appeased, as they would call it, Caribbean identity in the French metropole, in the French hexagon. And one of their sort of purposes is to try and, one of their goals is to try and follow this blueprint, this activist memorial blueprint, to talk about their own bond with France. And that bond, of course, starts with the history of enslavement, with the history of enslavement of Africans in French colonies, and therefore also the creation of Creole societies. And in order to talk about this bond, they use the same language of devoir de mémoire, of the state's duty to remember its victims, but also for the memory of its citizens. And this kind of development of tying this devoir de mémoire to the history of enslavement is a process that you can see in the very late 1990s, and especially with the articulation or the formulation, the gestation of the Taubira law. So it is a law that recognizes the enslavement of Africans or the Atlantic slave trade as a crime against humanity. It's named after the politician Christian Taubira, who also later became Justice Minister, who actually uses this concept of devoir de mémoire to then pass a law that was shaped after sort of this kind of memorial blueprint, trying to acknowledge a crime and trying to give a voice to teaching it. So it's one of these kind of new so-called memorial laws.
Yeah, well, plenty of such examples, and I wonder, you started off studying this topic just France alone. That was the original project, but then it turned into a comparative study. Why wasn't France enough?
It started actually as a comparison at first. The first idea was actually, so we're talking about the gestation of research projects. My first idea was to work on it as a comparative study. But at the time, what I was confronted with was having a richness of information, a richness of research about memory in France. So we're talking about the very early 2010s, very early tenors. And by that time, there had been an explosion of memory, of colonial memory debates in France. 2011, even in France, the school curricula had been changed to include the memory of the Algerian War of Independence as a subject in the baccalaureate, so in the leaving certificate. So just to show how advanced it is to not even talk about colonial history, but colonial memory. Britain, not much. So it felt like it was a lot safer to work on something that already existed. It could talk about memory. There'd be so much to look at. It would be so thick, as my supervisor once called it. But at the same time, one of the things I found interesting is looking at this comparison between this extremely thick context, but also another context, the place I grew up in, the place I knew, and a place in which you would expect a lot more to have been written on. And the thing was that around this period, it wasn't that nothing had been written about colonial history in Britain. There was extremely rich literature and academic literature about colonial history, much more than in France. Britain had a far richer historiography of colonialism, and also a lot more post-colonial literature, whereas in France it was just kind of starting to take root. The difference was that in France there was a very live and vivid political debate about commemorating colonialism and commemorating the crimes of colonialism, whereas in Britain this whole range of rich literature had not necessarily trickled down to politicize the debate, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, but is it because, as we said earlier about the Algerian War, colonial memory is much more recent in France than it is in Britain? And in Britain, pretty much, because it was part of the whole tumultuous period of the Second World War and its aftermath, they could just, turn over the leaf and treat it as some sort of like a chapter in the distant past. But also because, as it seems from the debate, I mean, what causes debate is controversy. And in France, the memory of the Algerian War, but also the empire, was a lot more controversial in the sense that there was actually a debate of people who were for and against rather than Britain, whereas it was pretty much consensus that it is good that the empire is in the past.
So there are many things here, of course, and I think that one of the things I've come to try and realize or to talk about, to write, to articulate, is just that, first of all, it's very hard to say why a debate doesn't emerge. It's very easy to say, well, not very easy, but it's a lot more possible to say why a debate emerges, like in France. And that was also one of the big challenges at first, seeing a lively debate in France, but then seeing not very much in Britain. And it's very hard to say why people don't start a debate. And that's the first thing. The second thing is that when trying to compare these things, and in Britain's case, much of it is looking at roads not taken rather than roads taken. At the time, one of the issues was that in many cases, the actual sort of history, the timeline was not that different. Of course, there are huge differences in terms of the actual sort of events that led to decolonization. Of course, the reason that in Britain you have this myth of peaceful decolonization starts with some actions of peaceful decolonization. And yet, even in Britain, really kind of the last waves of independence happened around the same time as in France in the mid-1960s. India may be shown as Britain's Day of Joy in the 1940s, and yet it is followed by the violence of partition. The British decolonization is not as peaceful as the myth tells us between wars in Malaya and in Kenya with the Mau Mau insurgency. There are quite a few horrors of decolonization in Britain. Afterwards, what you can also see is that many of the debates that actually happen in France, they also happen through another issue that we haven't talked about, and this is talking about race, talking about France as a post-colonial society. But Britain has the same issues. And yet, one of the things you see is that with these same issues, debates did not emerge at the same time. And also there is a third thing, and this is again something that you see especially in the last 4 years, ever since these debates have been taking center stage in Britain, is that there's always been this assumption, weirdly, that colonialism is an emotive subject in Britain. And yet there's been very little actual sort of controversial debate about it. When it did happen, and that kind of following, you can say the crisis mode after 2014, 15, 16, you can see that it has the potential to rally controversy, to rally emotion. Now, the question is, why did it not happen before? Why did it happen in France? And to this, I do not have only one answer. And of course, one of the reasons this happened in France could also be traced to the continuity of memory debates from Vichy. That, of course, never happened in Britain. I mean, and even when it did happen in Britain in the last few years, from debates about statues, roads must fall, and this kind of endless kind of talk about the balance sheet of colonialism, one of the things that I find extremely pertinent in the difference between the two debates is that the word memory is never uttered in Britain. In France, through this kind of propagation of this idea of needing to come to terms with the past to create a better society. No, never forget, always remember. There is a certain political logic to talking about memory. When certain actors, be them Caribbean activists, African activists, Algerian activists, Chinois activists, trying to incite debate about memory, they knew that this was a political issue. In Britain, and this is also very visible in debates about enslavement in 2007, this was the bicentenary of the abolition of the slave trade, actually turned into some kind of a national event. There is difficulty in actually articulating why is it important to talk about it. Everyone knows that the past is important. Everyone kind of knows that. There is this sort of platitude, we need to learn from the past.
Sure.
But talking about the past, commemorating the past for the sake of, let's say, having a more truthful engagement with our own history, for the sake of just having some kind of a memory culture, is in itself not a political logic. In order to incite a debate about the past, you need to actually say that what it will do today. So 2007, one of the most striking things I found in the debate about historical enslavement is that it got very tied in with talking about modern slavery. Modern slavery is human trafficking. It's a horrible thing. Does it really have to do that much with the enslavement of racialized enslavement of Africans, the creation of new society in kind of societies in colonial?
Yeah, and the contemporary
relevance.
The contemporary relevance brings me to ask myself and you and the listeners, to what extent really is the existence of a post-colonial memory really key here? Because these are issues that are also dealt with in other countries. Of course, the United States, it has its own history with slavery, but it was never an imperial power, at least not officially. And also Germany, that was also never an imperial power, but also had its own racial history, not only in the 1930s and 40s, but also to this day, vis-a-vis migrants. I would like to ask you something that you academics just hate, and that is to broaden the scope to areas that are not within your expertise. But what do you think about, looking comparatively in broader strokes?
I'm already looking comparatively broad strokes. France, Britain, huge strokes. Now, I think these questions are, first of all, about how do you remember? Again, one of the problems, of course, with memory is the word remember, because we don't remember the past. We talk about it. We make it palatable to us, but you don't remember it really. So how do you mobilize the past? In a past that with colonialism, you have two things. First of all, it's now a past that is not that much within living memory. Secondly, it's a past that happens somewhere else, but has your own responsibility. I can definitely talk about Germany, because also Germany is now seeing these same debates. Now, Germany has, in the last few years, there's been this demand to talk about Germany's historic sort of colonial record, about the genocide of in Namibia, Germany's role in colonial expansion, and also how how this history and how these legacies might explain racism today. The thing is that if I look at memory as this kind of living public debate in which actors decide that a part of history is important for them to explain something in the present, then something about Germany is actually the case. The case in Germany is quite striking as a place in which these actors, again, can use very clear political rationale that exists there, talking about kind of Germany's Erinnerungskultur, kind of memory culture, which is a highly political subject, and say, well, this has been so related to the Holocaust, but this isn't the only thing we have. Let's also use this blueprint in the same way exactly like in France. But this is an
and do you see similarities?
I see, well, there are always similarities, there are always differences. I think one of the big similarities in Germany is, so one of the big things is that it's not always, in this case, one of the things I find interesting is also how concepts travel in a way that if in France you have had this kind of debate about the colonial empire and colonial memory for about 25 years now, many of the concepts of talking about colonialism today actually travel again through different channels. So in Germany, a part of talking about colonial history comes from actually borrowing from movements around Britain and especially the US that actually think about colonialism as a way of talking about race today. So in Germany, a part of it is, again, trying to start a conversation about race through vocabulary that is accessible through like the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, but also looking at the rationale of memory in Britain. One of the things that I didn't think I talked about here is also how in France, after especially 2005, memory is something that many activists use in order to be able to talk about race in a country that otherwise does not actually allow any kind of open conversation about race because of this kind of very idea of Republican colorblindness. So using this debate that already exists, a political debate that already exists, is a way of addressing issues like race that are far harder to address in public and that are far harder to articulate with the kind of your traditional French vocabulary. So much about memory really is a way of looking at the vocabulary that you have and trying to
Which brings me probably
it.
to my last question, and I'd like to ask you to answer briefly because we are quickly running out of time. But one thing, I don't know, it might be like a curiosity or something a bit odd and stupid. But one thing that struck me is that the many of the canonic writers on memory studies were French. We're talking about the founding fathers of the discipline, Émile Durkheim and Maurice Halbwachs, but also later people like Pierre Nora. Do you think that is just a coincidence, or is there more substantive correlation? That the frames of analysis fit the French case better.
I mean, there are also very important writers in Germany. There are many important writers I think what happens in France often, I'm not talking about Halbwachs because Halbwachs, of course, is very much before everything. I think one of the things that you see in France, probably more than in the UK, for example, or more than in the US, is that many theorists will try to follow the political developments rather than the other way around. There is a sort of conversation with activists. Not that any theorists will acknowledge that, but there is a certain sort of conversation with activists that is through the political context. Otherwise, I try not to generalize too much. I don't think there is anything in the French psyche that makes them a bit more prone to talking about memory. But
okay.
Go either way.
Well, Dr. Itai Lottem, thank you very much for joining us today. And you were talking about your new book, The Memory of Colonialism in Britain and France, The Sins of Silence. Thank you so much for this.
Thank you for inviting me.
And also many thanks to Itai Shelem, the manager of TLV1 Studios, and our producer, Ariel Cohen. And now we've got a request because many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review of any kind. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has well over 700 interviews. Please like us on Facebook. Follow me and Dalia on Twitter. She'll be back with us next week. And of course, join us again next week for that. And until then, goodbye.